Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of day people rarely remember. Not because it was peaceful, but because it seemed completely ordinary, until it wasn't. Inside the glass-walled penthouse of Pierce Tower, billionaire investor Alexander Pierce was reviewing the final stages of a $120 million corporate partnership. His office overlooked the entire Boston skyline, a world built on strategy, timing, and control. Downstairs, moving through the quiet rhythm of her morning duties, was Sandra James, the woman responsible for keeping the Pierce household running with precision. She was known for her discipline, her attention to detail, and her ability to notice everything without saying a word. And on this Tuesday, she noticed something. A thick envelope lay at the edge of Alexander's private mail tray. Stamped in red, confidential. Legal records. Normally, she would place the mail on his desk and continue with her tasks. But this envelope was different, heavier, almost rigid, as if whatever was inside wasn't meant to bend. Sandra didn't open it, of course. She simply delivered it to Alexander with the same professionalism she carried every day. "Sir," she said, "this came through a restricted channel. They requested it be handed to you directly." Alexander nodded, expecting routine compliance documents. But the moment he opened the envelope, everything changed. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a certified marriage license from California. The name on the groom's line wasn't his. It was the name of another man. Dated 2 years before his own wedding. Beside it, written in unmistakable ink, Camille Archer. His wife. The same woman who had spent the past week preparing for her international tech summit. The same woman whose company was about to receive the largest investment of her career from Alexander himself. Noah didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even look up. He simply stared at the impossible document in front of him. A government-verified marriage certificate. Filed quietly. Never dissolved. Never disclosed. Sandra watched him from the doorway, unsure whether to stay or leave. Alexander didn't show anger, confusion, or shock. Only calculation. The same look he wore when evaluating a failing company. He quietly dismissed her with a nod. And when she left the office, he leaned back in his chair, not in disbelief, but in clarity. This wasn't about love, he thought. It was about leverage, a backup plan she created long before she married me. For most people, this kind of discovery would trigger confrontation, shouting, accusations, emotional chaos. But Alexander Pierce wasn't most people. He was a strategist. His power was not in reacting, but in staying still. That evening, while Camille's private jet lifted off for London, Alexander remained in his office long after the sun faded from the skyline. Sandra returned once to offer him coffee. He didn't drink it. He didn't need to. Something else was keeping him awake, the truth in that document. He reviewed every shared contract, every financial clause, every asset connecting his empire to Camille's. By midnight, he made the decision that would change both their lives forever. He called his senior board members, his voice calm and steady. "We are withdrawing from the partnership. Effective immediately." One sentence. One order. And just like that, he ended a deal worth $120 million, a deal Camille had spent 3 years preparing. Not out of revenge. Not out of anger. But out of self-preservation. By Wednesday morning, financial news networks were exploding with headlines. Pierce Holdings withdraws from Carter Tech deal, markets react. Unprecedented contract collapse sends shockwaves through industry. Sandra saw the alerts on the kitchen TV while preparing breakfast. Alexander didn't flinch. He ate quietly, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Because Alexander Pierce had reclaimed control, and Camille had no idea her entire world was unraveling. And this was only the beginning. When Camille Archer's jet touched down at Heathrow Airport, she believed her week was about to begin with triumph. She was scheduled as the keynote speaker at one of the largest global technology summits, a stage she'd been preparing for over a year. Investors were expecting her. The media was waiting. Her board was proud. But the moment her phone reconnected to the airport Wi-Fi, the life she left behind in Boston was no longer the one she returned to. Her screen lit up with an avalanche of notifications. 14 missed calls. 22 messages marked urgent. More emails than she could scroll through. At first, she assumed it was a technical glitch, maybe a system outage or a scheduling change. But then she saw the headline. Pierce Holdings withdraws from $120 million joint venture with Archertech, market reacts. Unexpected collapse raises questions about Archertech's stability. She froze. Not outwardly. Camille had mastered the art of staying poised, but internally, her pulse hammered against the silence of the car waiting to take her to the summit. This was impossible. The partnership had been approved. The paperwork was nearly finalized. Alexander had personally reassured her last week that everything was on schedule. She opened the article. Sources close to Pierce Holdings confirmed the withdrawal was initiated directly by Alexander Pierce, CEO. No public explanation has been provided. Camille's fingers tightened around her phone. No explanation. No warning. No message from the man who had supported her through every phase of her career, until now. She quickly typed, "Call me. Immediately." No response. She tried again. Still nothing. For once, her famous composure began to crack, not enough for the driver to notice, but enough for her to feel the truth creeping in. Alexander never made abrupt decisions. He never backed out of deals without strategy. And he never ignored her calls. Something had happened. Something she wasn't prepared for. Sandra James stood at the marble kitchen counter, rolling silverware in linen napkins, listening to the morning news report softly in the background. The unexpected withdrawal of Pierce Holdings has left Archertech facing a confidence crisis, with investors demanding transparency. Sandra didn't understand the financial world, not fully, but she understood consequences. She'd seen enough families go through private storms to recognize when something had shifted, silently, deeply, irreversibly. Alexander sat at the breakfast table, reading a printed report. Calm. Unmoved. Focused. Sandra placed his tea beside him. "Thank you," he said, his voice gentle but distant, the same tone he used on days when his mind was 10 steps ahead of the room. She hesitated. Not to question him, she would never cross that boundary, but because she felt a tension hanging in the air, fragile and unmistakable. He looked up. "Sandra," he said quietly, "if anyone reaches out for information about our internal decisions, direct them to the corporate office. No commentary from the household." "Understood." "Yes, sir." She didn't need to ask why. His expression told her enough. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a line drawn. And whatever sat behind that line was something he had already accepted. Camille walked into her luxury hotel suite with one goal: get answers. She dialed Alexander again. No answer. She opened her email. Still nothing from him. But her legal team had sent 3 messages flagged red. Her CFO had sent 6. Investors were asking for immediate statements. Her board wanted an emergency call. The tech summit organizers were asking if she still planned to appear. For the first time in her career, Camille Archer didn't know what to say. She recorded a quick voicemail, her voice steady but tightened beneath the surface. "Alexander, I need to understand what you're doing. Pulling out of the partnership without notice is eroding investor confidence. Please call me." She forced herself to breathe, set her shoulders, and prepared for her keynote session, outwardly polished, inwardly unraveling. While Camille stepped onto a London stage, Alexander was in a closed-door strategy session with his legal and financial teams. The tone was controlled. Professional. Unemotional. Exactly how he preferred difficult decisions to be handled. "Has all shared documentation been retrieved from her access folders?" he asked. "Yes, Mr. Pierce," his compliance director replied. "Everything tied to the joint venture has been removed. Her team can no longer view any updated financial models." "And our withdrawal statement?" "Filed and confirmed." Alexander nodded. In front of him was the marriage license Sandra had delivered 2 days earlier, placed inside a folder labeled simply, "Private." He didn't open it again. He didn't need to. The truth, once confirmed, did not require rereading. He dismissed the team, remaining alone in the conference room as the lights dimmed automatically. On the table sat the documents that once represented a future, A partnership, a shared empire, a life built on the illusion of unity. Now, they were simply paper. After her keynote, Camille stepped off stage to find her assistant standing stiffly, holding her tablet like a shield. "Camille, your board has called an emergency meeting. They're asking for answers." "So am I," she whispered. Her assistant looked away, uncomfortable. "Investors want to know if something happened between you and Mr. Pierce." Camille's jaw tightened. Nothing happened. But something had changed. Her mind raced through possibilities. A leak, a misunderstanding, a misfiled document, anything that could explain his silence. But she knew Alexander too well. Silence wasn't avoidance. Silence meant certainty. She sent another message. "Please talk to me. Whatever this is, we can fix it." Still nothing. The quiet felt heavier with every passing minute. It was late afternoon when Sandra noticed Alexander in the study, staring at the window instead of his laptop. He wasn't the kind of man who wasted time. He didn't stare at nothing. He didn't lose focus. Something was breaking, not loudly, not visibly, but profoundly. Sandra paused in the doorway. "Sir, would you like me to bring dinner to your office tonight?" He blinked once, as if returning from someplace far away. "No, thank you. I'll eat later." She nodded, then hesitated again. "Is there anything else you need?" He looked at her with surprising softness. "No, Sandra. You've already done more than you know." The sentence lingered. He didn't mean it emotionally. He meant it literally. The envelope she had handed him, the truth she unknowingly delivered, had reshaped the entire course of his life. By the time Camille returned to her suite that evening, news outlets were running analyses, investors were demanding transparency, and her company's stock had dipped 6%. Still no call from Alexander. Still no explanation. Still no clue as to what had triggered the collapse. But in Boston, Alexander knew. Sandra suspected. And Camille was finally beginning to realize. The cost of truth is always paid, one way or another. As markets shifted. As silence deepened. As two empires quietly drifted toward a breaking point. Sandra, Alexander, and Camille each stood on the edge of a truth none of them were ready to face. And before we move into the next chapter of this unfolding story, we want to take a moment to thank every one of you who's watching right now. If you're enjoying this documentary-style series and these real-life inspired stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications, so you never miss our new episodes. And let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We love seeing our global community come alive with every upload. In the days that followed Sandra's discovery, the mansion took on a different kind of quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of wealth, but the heavy quiet of something hidden, and something about to break. Sandra James didn't mean to get involved. She was a maid, a role she took pride in, not because of status, but because of stability. The Grant estate paid well, treated her well, and never made her feel small. But once she saw that document, a legal marriage certificate tying Camille Grant to another man, something shifted. Not curiosity. Not gossip. Responsibility. Because Sandra understood something that Camille didn't think a maid would ever notice. Paperwork doesn't lie. People do. And that single sheet of paper had the power to change everything. Sandra didn't run to Alexander. She didn't run to anyone. Instead, she went back to doing her work, dusting the stair rails, organizing the kitchen pantry, folding linens, anything to settle her thoughts. But she couldn't ignore the small details she had noticed over the months. Things she hadn't questioned before. Like how Camille often traveled alone. How she received private deliveries she didn't allow anyone to open. How she panicked whenever her phone rang from a Los Angeles area code. And how she once whispered the name Ryan in the hallway. A name Alexander never mentioned. Sandra had brushed all of it aside. It wasn't her business. She was an employee, not a detective. But now, everything connected. Meanwhile, Alexander Grant, billionaire founder of Grant Enterprises, sat alone in his Boston office late into the evening. His schedule was packed, as always. But his mind wasn't on business. Not tonight. He couldn't shake the feeling that something in his marriage wasn't real. Camille's distance, her excuses, her sudden need for creative space and solo travel. He didn't have evidence. Just instinct. And for a man who built a billion-dollar empire on instinct, That was enough. That night, without raising suspicion, he contacted Lydia Morgan, a private investigator known for her quiet efficiency and absolute discretion. "Look into Camille," he said calmly. "I don't want speculation. I want facts." Lydia asked only one question: "How far back do you want me to go?" Alexander didn't hesitate. "Everything." 2 weeks later, Sandra was polishing the silver in the dining room when Lydia arrived at the mansion. She wore a gray suit, carried a leather folder, and walked with the confidence of someone used to delivering uncomfortable truths. Sandra watched from a respectful distance as Alexander led Lydia into his study. The door closed. For 45 minutes, the house was silent. Then came a single sound, the creak of the study door, and Alexander emerged looking like a man who had finally seen the truth he'd been avoiding. No shouting. No anger. Just clarity. He thanked Lydia and sent her on her way, then returned to the study. Sandra didn't mean to listen. But she was close enough to hear Lydia's final words before leaving. "Mr. Grant, your wife's first marriage is still legally active. Everything you and she built together, personally and financially, is affected." It was the confirmation of what Sandra already knew. Alexander sat alone for hours, motionless, his eyes fixed on the marriage certificate Lydia had placed in front of him. The dates. The signatures. The location. Los Angeles County. It lined up with Camille's earliest business trips. Trips she always described as branding meetings. He wasn't angry about her past. Everyone had one. What he couldn't understand was the secrecy. Why hadn't she ended the marriage before starting a new life with him? Why had she risked his company, her reputation, and their future? And most importantly, was he ever her choice, or just her second option? In another part of the estate, Sandra quietly finished ironing linens, unaware that her world was about to collide again with the one she worked for. Later that evening, as Sandra was closing up the kitchen, Alexander walked in. It was unusual. He rarely entered the staff areas. He wasn't angry, or frantic, or tense. He was simply human. And tired. "Sandra," he said softly. She froze. "Yes, sir." "You've worked here 3 years," he said. "And you've never once stepped out of line." "I try my best, sir." "But yesterday, you found something." Sandra's eyes widened. He knew. "I wasn't looking for." "I know," Alexander said. "You weren't." He leaned against the counter, quiet for a long moment. "That document, how long have you known?" Sandra swallowed hard. "Since I found it. I didn't tell anyone because it wasn't my place." Alexander nodded slowly. "That's why I'm grateful you didn't," he said. "You showed more integrity in one moment than some people show in a lifetime." Sandra exhaled shakily. It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever given her. And then he uttered the words that marked the beginning of the shift, not just for him, but for everyone under his roof. "This stays between us, for now." Over the next several days, Lydia continued collecting evidence. A bank transfers from Camille to a Los Angeles studio, a late-night calls to a number saved under a false name, travel logs that placed her with Ryan Walker repeatedly, a legal form she never filed, or intentionally avoided filing, and a confidential letter suggesting Ryan had financial troubles Camille was quietly covering. The truth formed a complete picture. Camille didn't hide her past because she loved Ryan. She hid it because she needed him. And she needed Alexander too, but for very different reasons. One evening, Lydia delivered the final report. Alexander read it page by page. No emotion. No reaction. Just stillness. Sandra, passing through the hallway, saw him close the folder with deliberate calm, the kind that told her this was no longer about heartbreak. It was about decision. The kind of decision that only men like Alexander Grant made. Quiet. Permanent. Consequential. He stood up, walked to his desk, and placed the report in a drawer labeled simply, "Resolved." And then he did something that surprised even him. He smiled. Not out of bitterness. Not out of victory. But because he finally understood. Camille wasn't the one who held the power. He was. And now, she was about to learn it too. By the time autumn settled over Boston, the truth was no longer a question. It was a timeline. A pattern. A design. Camille Grant's secret marriage was no longer a rumor waiting to surface. It was a fact, verified, documented, and quietly placed in the hands of the one man she never expected to uncover it. But Alexander Grant wasn't preparing for confrontation. He was preparing for consequences, the kind delivered not with anger, but with strategy. And in the days that followed, every piece of his world began shifting, quietly. The mansion felt different. Sandra noticed it first, the way Alexander moved through the house with a clarity that bordered on serene. He didn't pace. He didn't brood. He didn't seek explanations. He simply observed. Every morning, he followed the same routine: coffee at 6:30, emails until 7 o'clock, conference calls from 7:30 onward. But there was a new layer beneath the routine, a quiet calculation. Because Alexander Grant wasn't acting like a man who'd been betrayed. He was acting like a man who had made up his mind. Camille, meanwhile, floated through the estate in her usual glamour, confident, polished, assuming her life was still perfectly intact. She had no idea the ground beneath her had already shifted. It started with a phone call. Not from Alexander. Not from Lydia. But from the Grant Enterprises board chairman, a man who rarely contacted Alexander's household directly. His voice was polite, but concerned. "Alexander, we've been reviewing the joint venture documents with Carter Solutions. There seem to be inconsistencies in the legal filings on their end. Dates. Ownership disclosures. A few unusual amendments." Alexander listened calmly. He already knew. "Thank you," he replied. "Place the partnership under review. Quietly. Keep it internal." Camille wasn't informed of the call. She was busy preparing for an upcoming product launch, a launch she believed would elevate her company to the global stage. But what she didn't know was that her company was slowly becoming a question mark in the business world. And question marks attract attention. Meanwhile, Sandra's position inside the estate began to change, quietly, naturally, without announcement. Alexander started asking her questions. Not personal ones. Not invasive ones. But questions about timing, behavior, small details she might have observed simply by being present. Sandra answered carefully. She had never been one to gossip. But she also wasn't someone who lied. And every small detail she confirmed painted an even clearer picture of Camille's deception. One evening, as Sandra finished setting the dinner table, Alexander approached her with a simple question. "How long have you felt something wasn't right?" Sandra hesitated. "It wasn't my place to say anything, sir. That's why you're the only one I trust to tell me the truth." Sandra's heartbeat quickened, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Her role in this household was changing. And for the first time, she realized something she never expected. Alexander didn't just see her as staff. He saw her as the only person who had no interest in the benefits of his wealth, and therefore the only person with nothing to gain from distorting the truth. It was a rare kind of trust, and one that neither of them took lightly. 3 weeks later, Camille received her first warning sign. Her CFO called during a breakfast meeting, voice trembling. "Camille, we need to talk. The board wants an internal audit of all your out-of-state expenses from the last 3 years." Camille blinked, confused. Why? Who initiated that? The investors. They're concerned about irregularities. Irregularities. A word that could end careers. Camille didn't panic, not externally. Instead, she reassured her team, scheduled a meeting, and prepared her usual poised responses. But when she ended the call, her hand shook slightly. Because she knew what they would find, if they looked deep enough. Meanwhile, Lydia's investigation was complete, airtight, thoroughly documented, and backed by government records. She delivered the final binder to Alexander personally. He opened it. He reviewed every page. He absorbed every detail with quiet clarity. When he finished, he closed the binder softly. "This is enough." Lydia nodded. More than enough. He didn't ask for follow-up. He didn't request additional digging. He had everything he needed. And more importantly, he understood what Camille had done, and why. Not because she loved someone else, but because she feared standing alone. It was never about romance. It was about identity, control, security. That realization didn't soften the truth. It made it sharper. One evening, The Grants hosted a small business dinner, for guests, a polished menu, and the immaculate elegance expected of the Grant household. Sandra oversaw the preparations, working with precision. She moved through the dining room with the quiet grace of someone who understood the importance of appearances, especially that night. Camille walked in wearing a diamond bracelet, radiant and confident. Alexander entered moments later, expression unreadable. Throughout dinner, the atmosphere was polite, cordial, even. But beneath the smiles and professional conversation, something unseen simmered. An imbalance. A shift. A truth lingering unsaid. Halfway through dessert, one of the guests, a board member from Grant Enterprises, mentioned the ongoing audit at Carter Solutions. Camille stiffened. Alexander simply lifted his glass and offered a neutral comment. Transparency is important in business. It builds confidence. His tone was even. His expression calm. But Camille felt the message beneath the words. She excused herself from the table soon after. Later that night, Camille found Alexander in his study. She stood in the doorway, hands clasped. Alex, is there something you want to talk about? You've been distant. Alexander didn't look up from his paperwork. Have I? Yes, she said quietly. I can tell. He finally raised his eyes, calm, steady, unreadable. What would you like to talk about, Camille? She hesitated. The truth was right there on her tongue, the truth she had been avoiding for years. She could have said it. She could have admitted everything. She could have chosen honesty. But she didn't. Instead, she said, "Is this about the partnership review? Because I can explain." Alexander cut her off gently. No explanations needed. His tone was kind, which somehow made it worse. Camille swallowed hard. Are you upset with me? Alexander closed his folder. I'm not upset. I'm informed. She froze. Informed. The single word that told her exactly how much he knew, and how long he'd known it. Before she could respond, he added, "We don't have to discuss this tonight." And with that, he dismissed her without raising his voice. It was the quietest ending to the loudest truth. Meanwhile, Sandra watched from the periphery, seeing changes none of the dinner guests could have noticed. Camille walked differently, a little faster, with a little more fear hidden behind her posture. Alexander moved with finality, not anger, but certainty. And Sandra, standing in the hallway with freshly folded linens, realized something profound. The fall had already begun. Camille just hadn't reached the bottom yet. A week later, Carter Solutions Board convened without Camille present. Their lead attorney laid out the findings of the audit. Undisclosed expenditures are private payments to third-party entities, travel inconsistencies, a breach of filing requirements, and a questionable LLC tied to a man named Ryan Walker. The board members exchanged looks of quiet concern. One asked the question on everyone's mind. Does Mr. Grant know about this? He hasn't made any public comment, the attorney replied. But based on our information, we believe he knows everything. That sealed Camille's fate. She would not be removed. Not yet. But she would be suspended, pending review. 2 days later, Camille received a formal letter from her board, requesting her temporary withdrawal from leadership. Her hands trembled as she read it. She sat down slowly on the edge of her bed, the weight of years of decisions pressing down all at once. She wasn't angry. She was overwhelmed. For the first time, she saw the truth clearly. This was her doing. Her choice. Her illusion. Her entire empire was crumbling under the weight of her own silence. And Alexander? He hadn't lifted a finger. That evening, Camille approached Alexander in the living room. She didn't try to frame her words. She didn't try to defend herself. She simply said, "I think I'm losing everything." Alexander's expression didn't change. "I'm sorry," he replied. "I truly am." "But you knew," she whispered. "Yes." "And you didn't say anything?" "I didn't need to." She inhaled shakily. "Why didn't you confront me?" "Because confrontation offers the chance to lie," he said calmly. "I wanted the truth. And I wanted you to hear it without my voice in the way." Camille felt the weight of that sentence. The truth was louder than any argument. and she had never been prepared to face it. The next morning, Alexander made a single phone call. Not to the press. Not to attorneys. Not to Camille. But to his board. Withdraw the partnership. All of it. Effective immediately. No anger. No explanation. Just clarity. And within hours, financial news networks reported the sudden severing of a $120 million deal. Camille's company's stock dropped. Investors panicked. Analysts speculated. But Alexander? He said nothing. Because the most powerful message is sometimes delivered through silence. For Camille, the collapse was swift. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just irreversible. She lost credibility. She lost control. She lost the partnership that held her company afloat. But what she lost most? The one person who once believed in her enough to sign his name next to hers, not on marriage papers, but on a future. In the quiet aftermath, Camille finally understood. Alexander hadn't punished her. He had protected himself. And Sandra? She watched the truth come full circle, not as a maid, not as a bystander, but as the one person who had seen the fall begin long before anyone else. And as Camille's world shifted beneath her feet. As Alexander stepped back without raising his voice. And as Sandra watched an empire bend under the weight of hidden truth, one thing became clear. The fall wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was quiet, and that made it undeniable. And before we turn the page to the next part, where everything changes once more, we want to take a moment to thank you for being here. If you're still watching, it means you connect deeply with stories about truth, power, and the unexpected ways life unfolds. Make sure you subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications, so you never miss our daily real-life inspired stories. And tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Your messages help this community grow into something truly special. Now, let us begin. And in this part, we discover what happens after the fall, when silence becomes clarity, and consequences become lessons. In the aftermath of the contract's collapse, the city seemed to hold its breath. Alexander Price, the billionaire whose name once echoed through boardrooms across the country, had withdrawn from the partnership with a calm so controlled it unsettled everyone around him. Camille Price, once the immaculate face of luxury philanthropy and polished elegance, now found herself surrounded by unanswered questions from the very people who once applauded her. And Sandra James, the maid whose discovery had unknowingly set everything in motion, stood at the crossroads of truth and consequence, caught between loyalty and integrity. This was the stage on which the next chapter would unfold. Not with shouting. Not with scandalous headlines. But with clarity that arrived quietly, the way truth often does. Camille Price sat alone in the penthouse living room, staring out at the New York skyline. This was the same view she once admired with unshakable confidence. Morning light brushing across high-rise windows, the city functioning like a well-run machine, wealth tucked neatly into every corner of her world. But that morning, the skyline didn't look like an achievement. It looked like a reminder. A reminder that everything she had built rested on the one thing she had taken for granted. Trust. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message. Not from Alexander. Not from her board. Not from her legal team. But from a longtime investor she considered a friend. Camille, we're temporarily pausing our funding commitments. We just need clarification on your financial structure with Walker Development, LLC. Please respond by Friday. She closed her eyes. There it was. The name she feared the most. Walker Development, LLC. The same shell company Ryan Walker, her former fiancé, had convinced her to fund during a period of emotional confusion years earlier. The same company Alexander had quietly flagged after seeing irregular transactions. The same company Sandra had inadvertently exposed when she found the folder, filed away, but not erased. Camille wasn't a criminal. She had never intended to deceive anyone. But intent doesn't erase consequence. She whispered to herself. Why didn't I end that chapter when I said I did? There was no answer. Just the soft hum of a refrigerator and the weight of a truth she could no longer outrun. In Chicago, hundreds of miles from the penthouse he once shared with Camille, Alexander Price walked through the lower floors of his new headquarters. He had always loved being close to the work, meeting young interns, checking progress on infrastructure models, speaking with engineers about small-town redevelopment. Today was no different. Except he carried a heaviness that he never showed. His assistant, Claire, approached him carefully. "Sir, your noon meeting with the Ethics Committee has been confirmed." Alexander nodded. "Thank you. Tell them I'll be there on time." She hesitated, then said softly, "Are you sure you want to handle this alone?" He looked at her with a calm so practiced it felt like armor. "I'm not handling it alone," he replied. "I'm handling it honestly. That's the difference." There was something about his tone, steady, measured, thoughtful, that told Claire everything she needed to know. Alexander wasn't angry. He wasn't vengeful. He wasn't lost. He was simply done. Not with emotion. Not with compassion. But with illusion. He had given the marriage every chance to stand on its own truth. And the truth had failed to stand. Meanwhile, in the staff dormitory attached to the Price penthouse building, Sandra James sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the envelope she'd kept tucked under her pillow. The same envelope she had returned to Camille and insisted she never read. But its presence weighed on her. She was a maid, someone who worked hard, minded her business, and respected privacy. Yet she had become the keeper of a secret worth more than anything she had ever held in her life. A knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Ms. Rivera, the building manager. "Sandra. Camille has requested to see you. She said it's important." Sandra inhaled sharply. She had been avoiding Camille for days, ever since the contract collapse, ever since she noticed the shift in the household atmosphere. But she nodded and followed Ms. Rivera to the main elevator. The penthouse doors opened to reveal Camille standing near the dining table, pale but composed. "Sandra, thank you for coming." Sandra lowered her eyes respectfully. "Yes, ma'am." Camille walked toward her slowly, her voice fragile. "I need to ask you something. Not as my employee, but as someone who was there." Sandra swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." "Did Alexander ask you to look into my things? Did he send you to find that document?" Sandra shook her head immediately. "No. Never. I saw something I shouldn't have, but no one asked me to. It was an accident. I promise." Camille studied her face. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Camille exhaled, a sound mixed with disappointment and acceptance, and whispered, "Thank you. That's all I needed to know." As Sandra left the penthouse, she realized something profound. Camille wasn't looking for blame. She was looking for confirmation. Confirmation that she had caused her own downfall. And Sandra had given her the truth she already knew. Back in Chicago, Alexander entered the Ethics Committee conference room with a calm presence. 10 executives stood as he walked in, a sign of respect. "Mr. Price," the chairwoman began, "we'd like to understand your decision to withdraw from the Carter Partnership with no public explanation." Alexander took his seat. "I withdrew because the partnership wasn't stable," he said simply. "Were there improprieties?" she asked. There was a long pause. He could have said everything. He could have exposed Camille's past, the secret LLC, the old marriage documents, the questionable financial support for Ryan Walker. He could have destroyed her credibility in one sentence. But that wasn't who he was. "No," he answered. "There were no crimes. Just misalignment. And I chose to prioritize the integrity of my organization." The chairwoman studied him. "Do you have anything to add?" Alexander looked out the window, toward the city he now called home. "Sometimes," he said, "people make mistakes they don't know how to fix. And sometimes the most respectful response is distance." The committee nodded. And just like that, the meeting ended. No drama. No spectacle. Just professionalism. The exact opposite of what Camille had feared. Camille sat in the office she used for press days, a beautiful space with cream-colored walls, modern sculptures, and a single orchid perched in the corner. Her lawyer, Morgan Davis, sat across from her. "Camille, the board wants a statement from you. Something concise, controlled, and calm." Camille nodded. "What do they want me to say?" "That you acknowledge strategic oversights. That your past decisions lacked transparency. That you are stepping back to reassess your leadership approach." Camille looked down at her hands. For 20 years, those hands had signed deals, shaken donors' palms, applauded at charity galas. Now they trembled. "Morgan, Do you think people will forgive me? He hesitated. Forgiveness isn't guaranteed, but accountability is respected. Tears gathered at the corner of her eyes. Not dramatic tears. Not emotional collapse. Just the quiet realization that she had crossed a line she never intended to cross. And the only way forward was acknowledgement. She took a deep breath and said, "Let's write the statement." That evening, Sandra returned to the penthouse with her cleaning supplies. The atmosphere felt lighter, less fragile. Camille looked up when Sandra entered. "Thank you, Sandra," she said quietly. "For what, ma'am?" "For telling the truth. Even when it hurt." Sandra nodded, unsure what else to say. Then Camille added, "If you ever want to leave housekeeping, if you ever want to build something for yourself, tell me. I'll help." Sandra blinked, stunned. "Ma'am. You were honest when I wasn't. That matters." It was the first time Camille had acknowledged that honesty had consequences, but not always punishment. Some truths, even painful truths, lead to clarity. And clarity can lead to growth. Weeks later, Alexander walked through a community center he had funded, a place offering youth mentorship, small business workshops, and financial education. A woman approached him with a warm smile. "Mr. Price, thank you for everything you're doing here. You're changing lives." Alexander smiled politely. "I'm just doing what I should have been doing all along." Sandra's words echoed in his mind, reminding him that truth, when handled with grace instead of anger, becomes a foundation. A foundation stronger than wealth. Camille finally addressed the press 2 months after the collapse. Standing at a podium in a navy blue suit, she looked composed, older, wiser, quieter. "I made decisions in my past that lacked clarity," she began. "I allowed old relationships to affect new responsibilities. And I failed to uphold the transparency required of someone in my position." Reporters scribbled. But Camille continued. "I am stepping back to focus on my personal development and ethical leadership. And I want to thank every person who has supported me through this. Mistakes do not define us. How we respond to them does." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defensive. It was human. 3 months later, Alexander received a single text from a number he had not blocked, but never responded to. From Camille, "Thank you for choosing silence. It taught me what accountability really means." Alexander read it. Then he locked his phone. No reply. No bitterness. Just closure. The billionaire, the black maid, and the woman who tried to outrun her past, all learned that truth doesn't destroy people. Secrets do. And when silence is chosen with integrity, it doesn't punish. It transforms.